File item 8, lead scientist report, Dr. Goodwin. And I need to mention, before the meeting, I pointed out to Dr. Goodwin that he has 4 items on his report today, and none of them have any good news. And I'll leave the response that he gave me to share with you.
Well, thank you, Chair Fiorini, and on behalf of the science community, congratulations.
Thank you.
And I think my response was, well, it really demonstrates why science is going to be so critically important in the coming months.
Good answer.
So congratulations, Chair Fiorini. I also can't resist the opportunity to make a couple of remarks about the outgoing Chair, Chair Eisenberg, which is probably why he's leaving the room right now.
Now, the reason he's leaving is both our wives are together outside, and he's feeling nervous.
Right.
Yeah. But I did just want to say on behalf of the science community and myself personally, many of you know Phil through the Delta Stewardship Council, but really his interest in understanding the science policy interface better goes way, way before that, of course, through most of his career. And it started for this effort through the Delta Vision. And we've just really appreciated his willingness to engage with scientists, to get involved. In addition to this forum, the talks he's given literally in Europe, throughout the state, throughout the US, has really, I think, been very formative and had a huge impact on how we think about the science policy interface. So we hope that Phil will continue that. The other comment I would make, for those of you who don't know how Phil interacts, he's probably one of the best read people I've ever come across. And several times a week you'll get these comments which will say, I'm sure you've seen this report, and it's a 1950 report about something, but if you haven't, and then it's usually very relevant and very interesting. So we hope that will continue. Before we get into the agenda, I'd also just like to make a comment about the ISB meeting last week. I think we have been very appreciative of the open discussion you had on the timeline in your last meeting, and the importance of trying to adhere to that. And it really put the ISB under significant pressure. And the meeting they had last week, what people need to realize is that they're not allowed to have open dialogue amongst themselves outside the public eye. But the ISB members came last week so well prepared on the areas that they had responsibility over. And the way I think that Dr. Collier was able to pull that together, it was an incredibly productive 2 days. And so if you hadn't participated in that, by the end of the second day, there was this laser focus. Here are the 10 big points. This is where we're going to delve into it in more detail. They were also did a very realistic assessment of what they could achieve in the timeline. And there were certain areas where they said, we really need help in those particular areas. So we've been able to fill some of those holes, particularly around adaptive management, to make sure this is going to be a comprehensive review. So particularly Dr. Collier and Dr. Norgard, I think you just did a great job in organizing that meeting. The next thing I would just like to mention, and perhaps if Jennifer Bigman is Jennifer around? Yeah, Jennifer, you'd like to just come up and grab a microphone. We just wanted to introduce one of our 2014 Sea Grant State Fellows. The State Fellows program differs from the Science Fellows, which you help support, in that the State Fellows is an opportunity for very talented young scientists to get experience within state agencies to really understand this science policy interface. So they join agencies for the period of 12 months. It's an extremely competitive program, and the group this year were just absolutely spectacular. So Sam Harada and Marina Brand, who were the main contacts, they just came out of the interviews and they said that this is very, very special. So I'll allow Jennifer to introduce herself in a moment. Her primary responsibilities is going to be working with Marina Brand and the Independent Science Board during the year. And we're very committed to ensuring that the experience that these folks get is very productive, not only for ourselves, but also for the State Fellow. So we require these mentoring plans both for our science fellows and for the state fellows. So Marina and Dr. Collier are currently working with Jennifer on this to see what she will achieve during the year, what activities she's going to be engaged in. So welcome, Jennifer. We're delighted you chose us over the many other offers you were given. So perhaps you'd just like to tell the Council a little about your background.
So I've recently graduated from Moss Landing Marine Laboratories with my Master's of Science in Marine Science. And there I worked on trophic ecology of fish, which is just fish diet. And before that, I was in North Carolina, and I got my Bachelor's of Science in Marine Biology. So I've strictly had a marine background, and that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to be working with the Delta Independent Science Board, because they're freshwater and estuarine, which is new to me. And I'm also a member of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN Shark Specialist Group. And our group addresses the threats and assesses the population status of certain sharks, rays, and chimeras in the North Pacific Ocean. So if anyone has any questions for me, I'd be happy
Jennifer,
to answer.
I wish to amend my previous comments for the audience's sake. The 4 items that I referred to on Peter's report did not include Jennifer. So I amend my comments and thank you for bringing good news to Peter's report. Any other comments or questions of Jennifer? Welcome aboard. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. We do have a second state fellow starting. You'll meet her in your February meeting. She's Mei Ling Rodham. She's starting with us on February the 5th. She's going to be working with Sam Harada, and one of her responsibilities will be by the numbers. So in this report, you'll see there's a lot of numbers there, but we just don't have that neat summary that was provided to you last year. So before I get into the actual items, which is as Chair Fiorini mentioned, a lot of pretty bad news. This is going to be a very, very tough year. I also just wanted to give you a brief overview of the sciencescape, what's coming up in the next 4 to 6 weeks, so what sort of activities you may want to follow on the web, or other activities you may want to participate in person. So the first thing I want to give you a quick update on, Chair Fiorini had requested an update in every meeting on the Science Action Agenda. I was actually out of the country for a little while, so it's not there. But just so you know, this, of course, is a priority for us. I just wanted to remind everyone that this is an interim Science Action Agenda. It's a slightly scaled-back version of what appears in Appendix C of the Science Plan. The reason for that is that to put these Science Action Agendas, the experience of Dr. Collier, many other systems, is it really takes 2 years to get a list of priorities put together, and we simply don't have the time to wait. So what we're doing is conducting a synthesis of all the significant science priorities and work plans that there are out there. This includes synthesis reports, review panels, the ISB memos and white papers that have been put out in the last 12 months, the work that BDCP is putting out, IEP, there's the camp process, there's our own CARBA seminars, the exploratory workshops which we run. You're going to be hearing this afternoon from Jessica Davenport with her white paper on restoration, and of course there's a white paper that Chair Fiorini put together. So we've listed, there's close to 40 of these major reports all dealing with different aspects of science. So our idea in this interim Science Action Agenda is to map these various activities, identify where there could be synergies that aren't occurring right now, where there are overlaps, and perhaps most importantly, where are the critical gaps. So particularly in the light of the drought, which is likely to affect us during the next 2 years, how can that be put together? The full Science Action Agenda, just to remind you from the timeline in the Science Plan, will be completed in 2016. But this will be a working document. Of course, like everything we do in the Council, it will be a fully open process. It will be guided by the Science Steering Committee that's described in the Delta Science Plan. And we're also planning on using the opportunities that are afforded by science meetings and specific workshops which are coming up over the next 6 to 10 weeks. So that's the overall Science Action Agenda, but in addition to that, there's some specific actions, if you recall, that had been prioritized with your approval that really need to get done. So some of the other major activities which we've got underway right now is the state of Bay Delta science. It's good to see Charles Gardner in the audience. Of course, part of that is to have a baseline so that we can measure the progress of science, the impact of this more coordinated scientific approach into the future when we start refining the performance metrics. And I'd like to acknowledge the support we're receiving from the USGS to get this done in a timely fashion. And Darcy Austin from the USGS, who was actually the lead coordinator of the last State of Bay Delta Science, the USGS have kindly agreed to assign her this year to lead the coordination of the chapters for that. Two other big events that are coming up. You'll recall that we were suggesting summits. I think the discussion that the ISB had last Thursday and Friday with the Department of Water Resources on modeling really highlighted why this is absolutely critical. If we're going to understand how this big open system responds over time, and with the amount of scientific information that is being brought together from many different sources, it's the models that are going to integrate our understanding, and it'll be how we encapsulate our knowledge of the system. So we'd like to acknowledge the California Water and Environmental Forum, who've been working closely with us and others to plan that particular summit. Elaine Archibald, Ben Bray from QEMF, and Chris Enright from the Delta Science Program. The second initiative that we just had the initial planning meeting on is preparing the Bay Delta system to be prepared to respond in the era of big data for environmental management. And as you're probably aware, there's some really great initiatives going on. The Water Quality Monitoring Council, the Estuary Portal, many very great things that have somewhat limited time horizons. So we're trying to get ahead of the game, develop a much longer and sustainable strategy for getting accessing data and how that data is mined and used in the future. The interesting thing here is that in our original timeline, we had been suggesting this would be occurring over the summer and the fall. Both of the planning groups that we're working with in these, they both came out with the same thing. This is really very important. We need to get it done sooner than later. So we're looking at having these summits probably May, early June timeframe, and they'd be fairly close together. Skipping to just some of the other very big issues that you may want to track, at least to tune in and out of on the web. The BDCP Effects Analysis Review will be convening the panel on January the 28th and 29th. So as you're aware, the ISB are doing their independent review. You've got us and others producing an internal review. And in addition to that, there's an independent science panel. This is the third time they will have met. It's the Phase 3 review. This meeting will be webcast and recorded. It's chaired by Dr. Alex Parker. And we've been working very closely with the BDCP principals and with Dr. Alex Parker to really make this review as effective and as in-depth as it can be. And I'd just like to summarize this, stating the obvious. You remember Dr. Obvious on NPR a few years ago. I mean, this is just an incredibly difficult analysis to undertake. Here we've got this open, massive system. It's subject to many different stresses. And there's massive uncertainty around that. So what you're going to see coming out of this panel is, with the framework that's been put together, what's good about it? What are the existing challenges? It's not just going to be the normal scientific review where you're asking people to pick holes. This is such a complicated analysis. We want to know where the arguments are solid, as well as these deeper challenges. And also, how flexible is this analysis framework going to be to adapt as more information becomes available in the short term? So leading up to this, there's been a very strong dialogue between ICF, the primary consultants, your DWR and Reclamation. So I think this panel is going to be extremely effective. The panel themselves have been working on this since early December. So they're coming in. There's been webinars on this already. They've had a lot of information, of course, to review. If you have any other information on that, please ask questions either now or next week. The other two really big issues which are coming up in the next few weeks are the State Board workshops related to the Comprehensive Plan update. And as you're probably very aware, we were asked by the State Board to co-convene two workshops which were getting at some of the most fundamental issues. This has been run by Sam Harada and Matt Holland. Matt Holland was one of our staff scientists. He's just actually moved over to the State Board. So it's showing we have this really close relationship between the two agencies to run this. The first workshop will be February the 10th to 11th. The focus of this is delta outflows and related stresses. It's the first half of these analysis. The second workshop is going to be the first half or middle of April, and this is looking at in-delta flows and related stresses. So we divided the scientific discussion around those two issues. What you're going to see in these workshops, again, we're experimenting in the spirit of adaptive management, slightly different format. Again, there's a lot of information put out ahead of time, webinar lectures on the web, so that when this panel come in, they're going to be very well informed. In addition to that, the panel will be giving an idea of the kinds of questions that they're likely to have. So rather than it being a workshop of death by PowerPoint, which I know certainly former Chair Eisenberg just loved, that the idea is very short presentations and then discussion around these big predetermined questions. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. One other thing, just before I get to the bad news, another big issue you'll be hearing from Dr. Honeke this afternoon about the Ballast Water Initiative, which is, of course, of potentially incredible importance to the Delta and the Bay. Are there any questions? So I just want to give you a brief overview. This is the Sciencescape. You can see there's an awful lot of things going on right now.
Dr. Goodwin, the Water Board workshop, you said it was going to be divided into flows and other stressors?
No, the multiple stresses are being covered in both workshops. The first is dealing with this issue where there's a lot of debate about the delta outflows, the relevance of that. The second is going to be focused on the in-delta flows, the flow structures where the water goes with different extraction regimes and things like that.
Okay.
But the multiple stresses appears in both of the workshops. It hasn't been divided.
And this is in addition to the anticipated workshop on predation,
Exactly.
as a follow-up to the previous. Okay.
That's right.
Okay,
That's right.
thanks.
Are there any other questions on that? If not, I'll just touch very briefly on the bad news. The first item here, we were asked just to comment briefly on the specter of a possible mega drought. And this was one of the key features that the American Geophysical Union back in December chose to highlight. So if you're interested in this topic, I would suggest if you go to Climate Central webpage, if you just Google Climate Central, you'll find a lot of the discussion and the papers that were presented in this particular session. You're going to be hearing a lot about the drought later, so I'm not going to duplicate anything that you'll hear this afternoon. But this session at AGU, it was partially an outcome, I think, of the USGS Regional Climate Science Centers that were established 2 or 3 years ago. Also NOAA's Climate Change Program and the US Global Change Research Program that has much of the role that we do as a science program. They take that overview of what needs to be done, they set priorities, they have a great strategic plan about how the US should be addressing climate change. And so this session had many of the speakers that come out of these programs. And as we put here, a megadrought as a definition is where you have below normal flows, or critically below normal flows, for 20 or more consecutive years. And one of the presentations that was laid out was that if you look at this below you average criteria, much of the US has been in droughts that started in about 2000, so we're about 13, 14 years into this already. But one of the interesting talks here was given by Dr. Cook, who's the director of the Tree Ring Laboratory in Columbia University. And what was interesting about this, it stressed that everyone's focused on climate change, but there's natural variability in the climate. So Dr. Cook had looked back from tree rings, and so I'm sure you're aware of that. Basically, if you get a wet year, a tree is likely to grow more than in a dry year. And so you can see if you take a core through a tree, and if you have a series of years, annual rings, which are very, very small, consecutively, you can just count those up and see how many years of drought there were. And so in this research, Dr. Cook showed that way before the buildup of greenhouse gases had really started, there were very significant droughts. So, for example, in the medieval period, he hired an extreme drought, one of which lasted 28 years, the other 29 years, of critically low years, 28, 29 consecutive years. And there were also, going back further in the record, there were drought periods in some cases that lasted more than a century. In another study in this session, there was some analysis that was done that based on these analyses, there's about a 45% chance in this century of seeing a 10-year drought. So that's a drought not lasting 2 or 3 years as we're experiencing at the moment, but lasting in excess of 10 years. And there's less than a 10% chance of California experiencing a multi-decadal drought. So that would be these mega droughts of 20 years or more. And really, the point of this, and then Dr. Grumlick she's the Dean of the School of the Environment at the University of Washington and the co-director of one of these regional climate centers, actually made some very compelling connections to the changes we're likely to see through the ecosystem, that we're going to see these tipping points, and she used the example of the bark beetle, of just massive, massive changes across the ecosystem. And the take-home message is that we really need to start factoring into our planning and thinking, not just a drought that lasts for 2 or 3 years, but what are the possible consequences if we were to enter one of these much drier periods. Okay, the second piece of bad news is the fall midwater trawl results. This is the surveys which are done for fish species. I think for those of you who heard Dr. Anka Muller-Solger gave a brief presentation about a year ago about the sampling. So these fall midwater trawls, as it implies, it's midwater. It's not sampling the bottom, the edges of the channel. They will run transects throughout the delta at about 180 stations, and then sum the number of each of the species which are sampled from this method. If you're interested, I've actually got some of the graphics. But the important take-home message of 5 of these species, for striped bass, it was the 3rd lowest index, which is a measure of the abundance, how many fish are out there, since they started taking records 40 years ago. Longfin smelt was the 8th lowest. American shad was the 2nd lowest on record. And delta smelt was the 2nd lowest on record. What's critical about the delta smelt is that this index is used to determine the incidental take limit for the next season. So the fact that this is so low, it means the number of fish that can actually be taken by the pumps is also going to be a very low number. From the science community, it also affects studies. So a couple of years ago, it was a low incidental take, and the scientists who were collecting data were collecting fish as part of their sampling, and some of those studies actually had to be terminated. So I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that in the coming months, and we'll report back to you. The snow survey is also pretty bad news. We gave when this report was put together in early January, The snowpack or the snow water equivalent, a measure of the snowpack, is about 20% of the average for this time of the year. It's less than 7% of the average snowpack, and that number has actually been dropping. It ties the record low ever recorded, and many of the other indices are at an all-time low level, like the soil moisture deficit. But you'll hear more about that this afternoon. The last item on the agenda was quagga mussels. This is an invasive species. For the first time, this invasive species has been detected outside the Colorado River water. There's a mandatory boat quarantine in Southern California as a result of this. And the concern is that this is the type of invasive species that is a total game changer. When it comes in, it tends to entirely take over an ecosystem, at least in the short term. And it's one of these potential tipping points in an ecosystem. But I daren't say anything more about that because ever since I've been on this job, Dr. Bruce Herbold, who will be speaking next, I don't think, Bruce, I've heard you give a talk since I've been in California where somewhere the quagga mussel hasn't entered the...
I won't disappoint you today either.
Great, Bruce. So Dr. Herbold is an expert on this. He's seen it coming for a long time. He's, of course, an outstanding scientist in his own right. So I would suggest if you have any questions on that, we defer to Dr. Herbold in a few minutes. So are there any additional questions on what's going on in science? Yeah, Dr. Nordau.
Peter, could you discuss the relationship between drought and climate change, i.e. global warming?
Sure. Yeah. So drought is more associated with weather. That's what you experience on a year-to-year basis. So we're in a drought. That's a measure of the water that we're going to experience in this particular year. It's how the water managers, how the natural resource managers are going to have to respond from the available water. Climate change is more of a prediction. So that's what you get in some respects. Climate change is more projections of how we anticipate precipitation patterns, temperatures to change in the future as a result of the increase in greenhouse gases. So it's more a prediction of what we're expecting. With climate change, for me, the more scary point is, yes, we're facing these long-term trends. And, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about that other than that we know it's going to happen. So the question with these longer-term trends is, can the ecosystems respond and adjust in time before you become extinct? Or can we manage the ecosystems in such a way to give the ecosystem a chance to respond? For me, the more scary thing is it's not just the averages which are changing. The more scary aspect of this is that we're seeing much greater variability. And this is why we're seeing these extremes in the weathers that we experience on a year-to-year basis. So if we just look back in the last few weeks here, if you look the weather we're experiencing, and if you go to climate change or you just go on the web, it's really strange why we're seeing this weather pattern. There's a high pressure ridge that has just been sitting off the North Pacific and it hasn't moved. And you start out reading the climate scientists saying, this is extraordinarily persistent. This is remarkably consistent. And each week, the scientists become more and more surprised by this outcome. The consequences of that is we're seeing these polar vortexes on the East Coast pushing these incredibly cold air bodies down to levels which are extraordinary. And if you go to Northern Europe, when I was there, some of the biggest surf ever recorded because of the intensity of the storms, the precipitation patterns are breaking all records. So this is the kind of variability that we're seeing on a year-to-year basis in our weather that is highly likely a cause of what we experience on a day-to-day basis.
So is it safe to say that we do have climate change? the change is disrupting weather patterns. More rainfall in some places, less rainfall in other places. Talking about rainfall as opposed to water management. Can we see a causal relationship between warming in certain spots and drought? Is one a sequelae of the other?
Yeah, I think there's connection. So there's really two questions here. Perhaps the first question is, are the greenhouse gases the cause for this greater change, or is there some other reason? And so I think we need to separate those two questions.
We probably won't get an answer to that in this conversation.
No. But I will tell you where we could look, and
Okay.
certainly if it's something you'd like some more feedback on, I would be delighted to just do a little more research and come back, because there's been a lot of discussion in the science community. I think there's no question for certain parameters across the western states that we are seeing these trends that are quite extraordinary. Very simple parameter that I looked at with some colleagues 3 or 4 years ago. What day of the year does 50% of the annual runoff occur? So you look at streamflow records. And what you see is, yes, there's variability, but the trends are undeniable, at least in the Columbia Basin where we looked at. So what we're seeing is these much longer, drier periods. So if you're farming, of course, the timing of irrigation water, having to use irrigation water earlier in the season. So I think there's no question that we're having to deal with this, we're having to manage. In response to the question about what the cause is, I heard one of the members of the Nobel laureate team that do the, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. And when that press release came out in the fall of last year, the previous ones had got global press. It was a big deal. They came out with their recommendations. Here are their changes. And when the first one came out, it was about 50% of the scientists would stand up and say, yes, it's the global greenhouse gases that are causing this. And 50% of the science community said, no, the evidence doesn't support that. The point that this person was saying is that they did the same poll of the same group of scientists, and now that number is about 93%. And his point was that's about as close to certainty as you can get in the natural sciences.
In favor of greenhouse gases?
Yeah, as having some causative role in these changes which we're seeing. I'm just speaking on the remembrance of that, but if you're interested, maybe next month I'll come back with just a few more information on that survey that was conducted.
But whatever the cause, whether it's sunspots or greenhouse gases, whether they're man-made or not, I mean, certainly we have to deal with the effects of that. And it seems to be it's more about storage. That you're going to get areas of vast dryness and then areas of wet. And when you get the water, you've got to be able to retain that water and not have it flow out to sea. And you have to have deals where, I mean, I keep reading about the Chinese buying freshwater lakes in Alaska. And about water becoming, and even now, it's more, if you buy a bottle of water versus a gallon of gas, the water's more expensive.
Yep.
And that's going to increase. And it is our most precious resource, I think, other than people.
Yep. And I think, storage is critical, but there's many other steps which can help contribute, and I think it is going to be this multispectral approach to resolving these problems. And to be honest, I think what you're doing here in California is, I can tell you based on some discussions 2 weeks ago in Europe, people look to California because here we're dealing with the problems here right now. And with the reputation that California has for innovation, there's going to be many precedents set, I think, in the next few years.
Any further questions, comments for Dr. Goodwin? Peter, thank you very much. Our next item